Anna asked me to give this talk, of course, and I'm very happy to do it. And I'm going to tell you about a really important thing, really. Cliona kind of touched on it at the start there, that this is the 75th anniversary of probably the most important lecture ever given in the world, ever. Do you believe me? Yes. There is some evidence for this. It happened in 1943 when Schrodinger gave the What is Life lecture. And we think it's really important because it began the DNA revolution. And in many ways, DNA then began in Trinity with Schrodinger's lecture. I want to give you that story. And we're having this massive conference the week after next. We have the 75th anniversary conference to commemorate this big event. I'll mention that as well. Sadly, it's a massive sellout. It got so big we moved it from this building. I hope to have it here, by the way. We moved from here up to the National Concert Hall because it was so hugely oversubscribed. There's 1,000 people on the waiting list, terrifyingly. But talk to Janice, he'll sell you a ticket for €500. Okay, that's if you can get in. But it's an amazing conference, and we've attracted an amazing set of speakers who all know about Schrodinger and know about that lecture. I'll give you that towards the end. And really, I'm in a certain direction, I'm going to address the question myself. What is life? Because that was the question that Schrodinger asked. And it's a funny one in a way because there are many questions in science, as you all know, like what is gravity, for instance, you know, what is light? What's that smell? No, that's, whatever. But there's many questions. The big one is what is life? Let's face it. Can we understand the basis for life itself? It's still the biggest riddle of them all. And of course, famously, we use science to answer this. Don't mention God at all. Is Jules still here? He's gone. He's over there. No, he's not. Where is it? Sorry, in this particular lecture, we don't mention God with the what is life question. We use only one guide to our attempts to answer this question. The Royal Society's motto is nullius in verba, take nobody's word. That's that society's motto. 1660, that was the motto that Newton and Boyle came up with for that society. Take nobody's word. Show me the evidence, right? And we use that as our guide through this specific question anyway. What is the answer to this big question? What is life? And there's the man himself. Now, he came to Ireland at the behest of Eamon de Valera, as you may or may not know, in 1939. This may be the best thing de Valera did for our country as well, by the way. He convinces the Dáil, at that time, the poorest country in Europe. There were 2,500 people in secondary school in Ireland in 1939. That's all. 2,500. There were about, 600 people in university. Most people left school at the age of 12 in 1939. He convinced the Dáil to give money for the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. And it's very laudable. He said, we must try to do science in Ireland. Let's try and make an effort that Ireland should join the world stage and do real research. And he was modelling it on the one in Princeton. And he convinced them because he said they won't need much money. We will have 2 chairs in this school, one in mathematics or physics and one in Celtic studies, you see. And he said they won't need much, just a blackboard and a piece of chalk. There's no need for big equipment here. And he convinces them. Dillon, the leader of the opposition, is scathing. He says, de Valera, it's all about your personal vanity. You think you're a mathematician, you're not. You're stupid, You're an Irish scholar, you're not that either, And it was criticised heavily. To get through the Dáil, Fianna Fáil had a majority at that time. To get it through the Dáil, he became Minister for Education at the same time as Taoiseach, right, for 6 months. And he pushed it through the Dáil. And lo and behold, we get DIAS is founded. Now, the question then became who should be the first director. Now, de Valera knew about Schrodinger. He had a friend called Eddington in Edinburgh, who had been in Trinity, by the way. And Schrodinger was in trouble because he was in Austria at the time, and he criticised the Nazis, and he was in a bit of bother. He goes to Oxford, first of all, actually, to escape Nazi persecution, and Oxford don't like him. He stays there like 9 months and goes back to Austria again. They didn't like him because he was there with his wife and mistress, strangely. Schrodinger was famous for his personal life. Everything out in the open, by the way. His wife knew about the mistress, strangely. So he's back in Austria, and de Valera gets him out of Austria and brings him to Ireland. It's the biggest irony of all that de Valera turns a blind eye on the predilections of Schrodinger, you see, which just shows you. I call this an Irish solution to an Irish problem. How do you convince a Nobel laureate to come to Dublin? Ignore his private life, and he comes in there. So he gets Schrodinger in, and what was amazing was Schrodinger's only task as the head of this institute was to give 1 public lecture a year. That was it, right? That's all he had to do. The rest of his time was spent having deep, meaningful thoughts, presumably. And that 1 lecture a year was given a public statutory lecture, right? And that was all he had to do. Now, when he's in Dublin, one quick aside before we get to the meat of the matter. He becomes big mates with this guy, Flann O'Brien. They become really close friends. And Flann O'Brien loved Schrodinger, and of course he inspires the Dalkey Archive and the Third Policeman, you know, all this stuff in O'Brien's stuff. But I love this because O'Brien at that time was Miles Nagopoline, as you may know, in the Irish Times. And in 1941, the lecture that Schrodinger gives is all about the quantum world and how peculiar sort of matter is. And he begins to sort of speculate, Schrodinger, there's no need for a God. He kind of says, no need for a prime cause. Schrodinger speculates on this philosophically. The second lecture that year was given by the professor of Celtic Studies. This guy was an expert on St. Patrick. His name was O'Rahilly, right? And he says there was evidence in history of two St. Patricks. This is true, did you realise? One came from Rome, called Palladius, and one from Wales, called Patricius. And he says there's two St. Patricks. Schrodinger says, you know, the God thing is a bit peculiar and a bit difficult to pin down. The next day in the Irish Times, Flann O'Brien, in the form of Miles Nagopoline, says, isn't this wonderful, he says. We have these two overpaid professors in that terrible DIS place, showing off their knowledge, you know. And they're making a fool of us all over the world. Because one of them says there were two St. Patricks, and the second says there was no God, right? And that got people's imagination, you see, because Miles Nagopoline was a wonderful satirist, you know. But, of course, Schrodinger didn't mind. He carries on regardless, right? And here's a great shot at the time as well. This is Schrodinger here. See him in the front row there, towards on the right-hand side. This is a meeting of the Institute. There were 7 priests in this photograph. Isn't that terrifying? So maybe he was trying to find God in the end, you know. I wonder if Father Ted knew about this. It's ridiculous, all these physicists and these priests behind him. So Schrodinger loved Dublin and loved Ireland. Now, very importantly, in 1943, he decides to talk about what is life, this topic. Here's the very ad for the lecture. You know, it's going to be in physics, in the physics theatre, what is life, the physical aspects of the living cell. He gives 3 separate lectures on the 5th, 12th and 19th of February 1943. Here's a picture I found. I think maybe you said it was clean up with someone, actually. The Irish Times took a photograph just before the lecture. There's De Valera, there's the then Provost, Dr. Alton, and there's Schrodinger outside the physics building. I recognise the physics building. You know, there he is just before he gives the lecture. The What is Life lecture there is mentioned by the Irish Times, you see. And in that lecture, those lectures, Schrodinger does one thing. He asks one big question. He says, how can the events in space and time, which take place within the spatial boundary of a living organism, be accounted for by physics and chemistry? Very simple question in a way. He wondered, what's the physical basis for life? At that time, nobody knew what a gene was. Okay, the fact that DNA was the genetic material was not known. You know, our knowledge of life at that time in 1943 was very primitive, and here was a physicist wondering, what's a gene made of? You know, what about the physics of living systems? And very importantly, he says 2 things in his lectures. He says a gene must be a code. A code script is the word he used. The first time ever the term code was used for what a gene might be. And he draws it on the blackboard in the physics theatre. And he calls this an aperiodic crystal, which is a very strange thing now, you know. And what he meant was it must be stable because it's a crystal. You know, it must get passed on to the next generation. And it must have information, so it must be aperiodic. And that was what he called a gene, this physical thing. The second thing he talks about is order from disorder and kind of the entropy of living systems. He calls this thing negative entropy. Living systems defy entropy to stay alive, you know. We bring in ordered molecules to defy this second law of thermodynamics. And they were the 2 things he mainly talks about in this lecture. Now, the book is then published on those lectures in 1944. And everybody reads that book, everybody important, shall we say, in biology. Watson and Crick read it. Rosalind Franklin reads it. Maurice Wilkins reads it. Seymour Benzer, Leslie Orgel, all the key people who go into molecular biology, normally actually from physics, like Crick himself was a physicist, read Schrodinger's book and they began to wonder, can we find out what a gene is? Can we understand the physics of living systems? And that sparks a massive change in biology. Up to that point, biologists mainly caught butterflies with nets, you see, and put them between leaves of books. You know, that was biology. Suddenly, they're using X-ray crystallography to shoot X-rays at a crystal, and then we get the DNA thing. And it wouldn't have happened without Schrodinger. He was a physicist, and he inspires physicists and chemists to do biology. No question. And this has grown in the past. As Tina said, we remember this in 1993, the 50th anniversary, right? Since then, it's got more and more obvious how important these lectures were. Now, it's so important that this letter, we mentioned this a lot. In 1953, Crick writes to Schrodinger in Dublin. Schrodinger's living on Kincora Road in Clontarf. See, there's Dr. Schrodinger. Dear Professor Schrodinger, Watson and I were once discussing how we came to enter the field of molecular biology, and we discovered that we had both been influenced by our little book, What is Life? We thought you might be interested in the enclosed reprints. That's the goddamn double helix reprint, the paper in 1953. And look at this. We think your term aperiodic crystal is going to be a very apt one. And that just shows you how important that lecture was. And that's a really key letter for us. And I met Watson about 7 years ago. I did a postdoc in Cambridge in the UK. Did a meeting of ex-postdocs of Cambridge, right? 7 years ago. 7 of us were invited. And I gave a talk about my research. And I said, the next speaker, Watson did a postdoc in Cambridge. The next speaker had a slightly more successful postdoc than me. I said, so Watson was on next, you see. And I met him afterwards. And I said, you want to go for a pint? And he said, the Irish are very ignorant. That was his immediate response to me. And I said, well, you're 21% Irish, right? That must explain why you're so awful as a human being. No, I didn't say that, but anyway. But he liked that. Watson, as we know, is a controversial, strange guy. He loves, to be talked to like that. Wonderful. Anyway, we go for a pint in the famous pub where they announced the secret of life. Because when they got to double helix, Watson and Cricks go into this pub in Cambridge called the Eagle, and they announce, we have found the secret of life. I said, come on, let's go for a pint there. He says, yeah, I'm amazed. Yeah, let's go there. But it's like bringing Elvis to Graceland, And he brings me to the very table where they announced it. This is the table. The same sort of photographs are on the wall. The RAF used to use this pub, and there was pictures of bombers, and at the same time. The beer is called DNA, by the way. They sell DNA. I'm not joking you. And he tells me the story. He said when he was 15 years of age, living in Chicago, he sees a review of the What is Life book in the Chicago Tribune. And he goes to the library the next day and gets it and reads it within 4 hours, read the whole book. And I'm going to go for the gene. That book was the thing that got him to search for the gene, hence his movement to Cambridge and so on, meeting up at Crick. Now, if we now consider for a minute, 1943, that lecture in Trinity sparks this revolution. And everything after that lecture then gives rise to all this triumph that we've seen in biology and all the DNA stuff and everything. Let's fast forward now 75 years. We're going to mark the occasion, remember, in a week and a half's time, the 75th anniversary. What's happened in those 75 years? And you would agree it has been spectacular. Talk about an advance for humanity. The massive amount of biomedical research, all this fantastic research in those 75 years. And we might ask the question now, what is life? And I'm going to break it up into 3 sub-questions to make it easy for you. Because you're on holidays as well, right? You don't want to be taxed too much. The Gauguin painting, and me and Clean have discussed this before, it's a bit overused, but it's good, right? So Gauguin had this great painting, where do we come from, what are we, where are we going? Let's ask those 3 sub-questions as a way to get at the question, what is life? And let's begin first, where do we come from? Now, I'm not picking on Jules again, but there's all these creation myths, The most famous one is 2 hippies and a talking snake. No, this is the Aboriginal rainbow serpent. These may be true, these stories, remember. People believe them. Show me the snake, I'll believe you, Show me the data. There are creation myths out there. We now know how life began. It began 4.2 billion years ago, is the first evidence of life on Earth, in rocks in Canada. The first trace of a living system. And we know the conditions on Earth must have been right for the cell to arise, is the idea here. The best experiment that was done to answer this question, the origin of life, is 1953. Miller and Urey, 2 chemists in the US. They recreate the early atmosphere of the Earth, which had methane, ammonia and hydrogen in a vessel. They put sparks through it like lightning, electrode, like sparks to create a catalytic environment. They bubbled up the heat with a Bunsen burner. Let that run. They closed it, a closed system. Let it run for about a week, okay? They came in a week later, having this run for a whole week, into the lab one morning. They came in a week later. And guess what? A tiny creature was... They found amino acids were made from that very simple vessel, that very simple gases. This tells us it's simply a question of chemistry. The events that happen that give rise to organic molecules to make a living system. That paper gets published in 1953. It's a single page in Science, that Science journal, right, in 1953. The same year as the double helix. This is the annus mirabilis for science, for us biologists. You've got the origin of life here through chemistry, and now the information molecule through DNA. And all of life can be summarized in this way. it's metabolism and information, and they feed across each other like this. That's a living system, you know. So this year, 1953, is really important for explaining the question, where do we come from? And that begins the whole thing. And then we know, you know, membranes form, you know, you begin to get the first cell arises, and then the first information molecules, RNA probably, and DNA becomes the next one. A very important discovery, though, in the past sort of 20, 25 years, which if you do genetics you hate, but it's true. Energy is as important as DNA. DNA is the molecule, of course, that mutates, and we see evolution happening around the DNA molecule, don't we? But energy is essential as well. And Nick Lane, who's coming to our conference, great book, The Vital Question, It's High Time Energy Joined DNA, as the explanation for the evolution of life. And why do we say that? Well, remember, 2.5 billion years ago, a great trick evolves on Earth. These things evolve. And now life plugs into the cosmos. We can now take energy from sunlight. That's a marvellous advance, you know. Previous to this, energy was all chemical on Earth, you know. Now we're connecting to a 93 million miles away thing, and now plants begin to photosynthesize. These things, plants, remember, take air and sunlight and make more plants. What a fantastic piece of biochemistry that is. The byproduct of that reaction, though, is oxygen, as you may know. And oxygen is very toxic. And it turns out the first great extinction happens 2.5 billion years ago. 98% of life on Earth becomes extinct at that point because of oxygen building up. Okay, because it's like rust, you know, you get oxidation of things. What happens next is really important. Two cells get together, okay? And this is a bacteria that can use oxygen. It evolves a way to use oxygen to burn food, goes inside one that can't. And now we have this thing called endosymbiosis. That's a random, really random event, most unlikely. Normally this gets eaten, you see, but this must have persisted. These things that go inside, we now call them mitochondria. And that's really important. Without mitochondria, there wouldn't be complex life on Earth. Because a complex living system has mitochondria, and all these things here, this is Nick Lane's quote, all complex life shares an astonishing catalogue of elaborate traits from sex to cell suicide, senescence, none of which are seen in bacteria. So this endosymbiosis is critical for us to evolve, because energy is now being captured really effectively by mitochondria, and you need energy to make complex life. So hence energy is a key part of this. And Schrodinger himself was kind of getting at that in his entropy phrases in his book. Now mitochondria are amazing things. They pump 10 to the 21 protons. Look at this. Every second. That's as many stars as there are in the universe. These little organelles are pumping protons. And you're using that proton gradient to make ATP, as you hopefully know. And then there you have your energy currency. Very important for life for this thing to evolve. So the first answer to the question is, where do we come from? The first cell that arose randomly via reactions 4.2 billion years ago. That's where we came from. Second question, what about us? We're so vain, you know. Where do humans come from? We now know the answer as well. We're 99.9% certain this is the origin of humans. Homo sapiens evolves in Africa 200,000 years ago, and then we move out 100,000 years ago. We're now in the Middle East. We go to Asia. We go to Australia 50,000 years ago. We finally, and rather disturbingly, go to America, you see, 15,000 years ago. We go to Europe 40,000 years ago. So we spread all over the world, and we meet our cousins, remember, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. There are two other types of hominids, and guess what? We have sex with them and we kill them, okay? Like the black widow spider. And you probably have 3% Neanderthal DNA in your system. Dermot Kelleher is 43% Neanderthal, sadly, but that's why he's been so successful. And this week in Nature, they've evidence of a Denisovan having sex with a Neanderthal. Even they mated. So, and in fact, many of our immune genes come from Neanderthals, incredibly. They're a very robust immune system. So we begin to mix and match, and then we get to Homo sapiens eventually. And then very interestingly then, of course, in Europe, we eventually build a ship, you see, and go and visit our long-lost cousins. This was a family reuniting after 75,000 years, because we split, remember. And now we build ships and go and see them and kill them as well, sadly, the Native Americans. Not a great history of humanity in a sense. But certainly this is where we came from. You know, this is the big answer. From Africa. And the offspring of Homo sapiens, Neanderthals and Denisovans. What amazes me about this is the evidence that we had sex with Neanderthals came from DNA sequencing, right? Svante Pääbo, who's coming to our conference, looked back in time with a very elaborate machine that we invented to read Stone Age DNA, amazingly. And now we know from the genes that we had sex with Neanderthals using this fantastic technology. And without that, we wouldn't have known this, that we did interbreed with Neanderthals. Very important. Now, second question, what are we? Right, now, very obviously, we're this. This is terrifying. You can blame biochemists for this, okay? So biochemistry, the big triumph was to break up your cells in your body and figure out what we're made of. And all of these complex biochemicals is what we're made of. And this is the Journal of Biological Chemistry. Now, I'm an editor of that journal. I've been an editor for the past 15 years. Since 1943, it's published 180,000 papers. Isn't that amazing? Each one a nugget, a little tiny piece of information that explains the biochemical basis of life itself, which is fantastic. All this fantastic knowledge is now grown and grown and grown to understand what we're made of, what the substance that are in our bodies. Now, very interestingly, 6 months ago, I got to the editorial board meeting for JBC. And they worry this journal. They've gone down in the goddamn rankings, you know, the different impact factors. Great journal, kicked by Nature, family journals and stuff. They worry about this. They got a robot to read every one of those papers. AI was used to read every single JBC paper. And they asked the robot, what's the mission statement of JBC? What do we stand for? And they were hoping the robot would say the molecular basis for life, say, or you know, the underpinnings of living systems based on molecular biology or whatever. The answer, sadly, was this. Western blotting, you see. This is the wordle they do for the JBC paper, so it's not quite as good as they think, you know. And I sometimes wonder, all these papers and all these students publishing them, you know, they are little nuggets of information, very, very importantly, to add to the mix. But sometimes you wonder about these journals and what they're trying to do. But this is what we're made of. This is a metabolic pathway in a macrophage, which we defined about a year ago. A macrophage has at least 114,000 separate metabolites. And amazingly, you remember Krebs' cycle? Fear in the room with a bunch of medics. Krebs is very important. So is all this. And metabolomics has opened up a new window on metabolites. What this means is DNA is for kids. DNA is a linear sequence of 4 nucleotides. That's really for children. You know, this is real life. Metabolism is really what life is. The information is important. Of course it's important, but this is what life really is, and we're still just beginning to understand the complexities of these pathways. And even more, a good analogy is DNA is a bit like income tax law. It's very important, but boring. Right? And even the man himself, look at this, Jim Watson, about a year ago in the New York Times, said this, look at this. The belief that sequencing your DNA is going to extend your life is a crude illusion. If you were going into research today, Watson said he would study biochemistry rather than molecular biology. I never thought about 2 months ago I'd ever have to learn the Krebs cycle. Now I realise I have to. Isn't that shocking? A man of his years as well, of course, he'll be struggling to learn Krebs cycle. But still, this gives you a flavour. And look at this, 2 more, little bit of science for you now, right? We're immunologists, me and Cleda, you know, and Dermot is as well. Mark Davis had a paper in 2015. Variation in the human immune system is largely non-heritable. So what's the point in looking at genes? You know, it's mainly non-heritable. Look at this. The microbiome is totally environmental, right? In your guts. So we've neglected this for too long. We've been seduced by DNA for far too long. It's a wonderful thing. I'm not knocking it, and I remember it's fantastic. But there's far too much going on there in terms of being seduced and being sort of dazzled by it. And a great example I decided to show you today is this as well. Lars Klarskog, who's a very famous rheumatologist, you may know him, came across this originally. The Swedish postal workers are very well measured as a group of people for over 100 years. And they noticed that the ones sitting in the first setting, just behind the steam engine, had a much higher incidence of rheumatoid than the ones in the second setting. A massive statistics there. Again, that shows us the environmental impact is huge on a very complex immune disease, you know, so don't forget the environment, very important. Another great example that Lars shows is this. Alcohol is your only man to stave off rheumatoid. Okay? And this is the incidence of rheumatoid, the odds ratio, with the increasing pints that goes down. I didn't show the rest of that curve because it goes up very quickly. so you've got to be careful. But again, environmental influence on rheumatoid arthritis, how much alcohol you're consuming. So remember, it can't just be DNA. The environmental impact is massively important as well. So what are we? We might answer it this way. Information, obviously, in the form of DNA, and highly complex metabolic pathways, both interacting with the environment. That's our current answer to the question of what are we. Very complicated, but all this great triumphant research allows us to give that answer. Now, the second thing we are is this, the mind, remember. The mind is what we are as well. And very importantly, you know, if Schrodinger was asking the question, what's hereditary, what's the basis for genes in 1943, that gives rise to this. That's mind-blowing. To think that you went from that question that Schrodinger asked to a double helix made of nucleotides, it's obvious to us now. But then, this is the most amazing, incredible, a double helix separating in nucleotides, and incredible, you know. The same thing has to happen with the mind. And we might try to envisage now, when we ask the question now, in fact, half the speakers at our conference are neuroscientists. Because the big question now in biology is, what is the mind? What is consciousness? And it's going to be unimaginable. It'll be as unimaginable as the double helix was when that was discovered as a way to explain something, really important. And in fact, 1993, the 50th anniversary, Roger Penrose is a very famous mathematician. He speculates in his lecture in the 50th anniversary about what the mind is, and he says microtubules, strangely, some kind of quantum oscillation. And that's 25 years ago. We've no idea what the mind is at all. Really challenging to answer that question. We know, of course, there's brain chemicals, and you've probably seen this kind of thing. There's anxiety, low serotonin. There's depression, again, imbalances here. There's love, isn't that nice? All three go up, And there's happiness. Can this be true, you'd wonder? Let's hope it is. But we've no idea, really. There's big advances here, of course, fantastic advances in neurotransmitters and so on. But still, it's the big unanswered question what the mind is. So our second question is, it'll be synaptic, of course, and metabolic. There probably will be new metabolic processes. There will be a physical basis for the mind. There has to be. Or consciousness, and it could be metabolic, we don't know. And again, it's high time energy joins neural networks now to understand the mind, that's my phrase, So again, we're just beginning to try to address this question about what the mind is, and we're nowhere near answering that question. Now, finally, where are we going? Well, this is the way we're all going, sadly, aren't we, There's no avoiding it, really. But look at this, I'd even tell this audience, have you ever seen the like of the medical advances in the past 20 years? Absolutely incredible. All these new medicines with more to come. And here's some of them, lots of tablets there. There is the first cell therapy approved, Kymria, the CAR T therapy for cancer. CRISPR is the big way to modify genes, and of course that may have a massive advance in terms of treatment of things. And then stem cells, there are 4 things I've just picked out, and you would agree it's spectacular. I just read a really good book actually by a guy called Ed Bullmore. I did a sabbatical in GSK 2 years ago. Ed Bullmore is head of neuroscience in GSK. He works on depression. His book is called The Inflamed Mind. And he says depression is caused by inflammation, you see. In that book, he says, in 1989, when he's training as a psychiatrist, nothing has changed from 1989 to today. If you're an oncologist and you were to use what was around in 89 now, you'd be struck off. That's how big the difference in oncology, Same with rheumatology. Again, you had massive advances, but there hasn't been advances in the mind. So again, we need to make progress there. But all these are wonderful medical advances that are coming down the track more and more because of all this great research that's going on, by the way. So answer one, where we're going, is great advances to improve human health into old age. That's the mission here, of course. New treatments for these diseases that afflict us is the big thing we're hopefully heading towards. And then we might mention this, of course, there will be AI, robotics, uploading your brain into a computer. Now, we will escape, the prediction would be, and our keynote speaker at the conference is Daniel Dennett. He talks about this a lot. We must escape biochemistry and DNA as a species eventually because they're crude and they're unstable. These are still very sort of rough ways of building something, and they break down. We will escape this probably eventually as a species. You might upload your brain into a computer and have avatars instead. That's as much a living system as anything else, This is like science fiction, but this is what they're all speculating now, that we'd escape these sorts of biochemical processes and go beyond them, and then become this. This is the famous data. I'm attempting to fill a silent moment with non-relevant conversation. That means you're Irish, doesn't it? Anyway, it may go to this eventually, you never know. So where are we going? Answer 2, maybe, escape DNA. It's only information, nothing fancy about DNA at all. And escape biochemistry, a very crude system. Maybe life in 100, 200 years' time will be escaping these processes. So to summarise, where do we come from? Remember, you're all taking notes, I hope. There will be a multiple choice question here with negative marking. First of all, where do we come from? The first cell, no doubt now, 4.2 billion years ago, improved energy use, complex life. Secondly, evolution leads to us out of Africa. That's where we come from. What are we? We're information in the form of DNA and complex metabolism and the mind. Very important part of us, obviously. Synaptic and metabolic. Where are we going? New medicines, obviously, and escaping DNA and biochemistry. That's one way for today, for me anyway, to have a go at answering the question, what is life? And none of this would have happened without Schrodinger's 1943 lecture. Remember. Now, we might finish with Schrodinger and the conference. I'm going to tell you a bit about the conference now, even though you can't come. Although we are live streaming, Shanna, aren't we? Yes. Schrodinger was a very interesting guy, actually, if you read about his life story, not just his private life. He was a poet, and he wrote lots of poetry. And he wrote this poem called Parable, which I quite like. He says, look at this, my friend, what in this life, that's getting close to what is life, what in this life weighty and important seems, whether causing dark depression or gladness and rejoicing to fathom nature, merely molecular collisions. Isn't that strangely depressing and uplifting at the same time in a way? So Schrodinger still wondered, about these great questions in many ways. And we're having a poetry session actually at the conference to commemorate this. And really, what he does is so important. Now remember, the What is Life lecture is a good example of civilization in action. And Ireland really saved civilization twice. The first time with the monks. Remember the Dark Ages? The Irish monks saved the Book of Kells, fantastic example. That learning was maintained in Ireland during the darkest of times in Europe. When did Schrodinger give his lecture? It was 1943, the darkest days of the Second World War, on a tiny country on the edge of Europe. Who would have thought? Very backward in its own way. He gives this What is Life lecture, and that begins this revolution that gives rise to such enlightenment and such advances. And there's a copy of the book. Now we have an exhibition in the long room, which will open, is it at the time of the conference? I think it's opening in about a week. We've found in our archive all these sorts of artifacts from Schrodinger. There's the original book. The book is 1944. He sends it to A.J. McConnell, at that time the provost. And there it is, and that's the original What is Life book, and he signs it. And it's World War II. The paper's really sort of, not great because it's World War II. And of course, we're also showing this. This is Ernest Walton's Nobel Prize medal. We have that on display as well. Now, Walton knew Schrodinger, and they met a lot because they were around here at the same time. And in our archive, we found this fantastic letter from 1966. There's an American journalist doing a history of Schrodinger, and he writes to Walton and asks him, did you know him? What was he like? And Walton writes back, and we have that letter in Walton's archive. He was a quiet, unassuming nature. His clothes appeared to be just what he considered to be the most comfortable to wear. He says his method of transport was the humble bicycle. Schrodinger cycled everywhere with a beret on and a pipe, and he's in from Clontarf every morning, very visible figure. But then, the wonderment is, Walton says this, I remember sitting close to him at lunch one day when the conversation turns to biological topics. Possibly it was at the time when he was contemplating what is life. He pointed out he'd inherited the somewhat unusual shape of his nose from his grandfather, and that the gene responsible for it must have been maintained at a constant temperature to within a few degrees for about a century, you see. Isn't that marvellous? Now remember, that predates DNA. He's not too far wrong. DNA has to be stable, So one of a record of Walton, and then there's Walton's medal, which is quite nice. Now, what about the conference? Okay. So how do you commemorate the most significant lecture ever given, certainly in Trinity, if not Ireland, if not the world? You organise a conference inevitably, and it's happening in a week and a half time. We're trying to mimic the 1927 Solvay conference. That's no less a goal than that. This is a very famous conference when they all turned up. There's Einstein, there's Marie Curie, there's Schrodinger at the back with his glasses and his very fetching dicky bow. There's about 7 Nobel laureates in that picture for physics. Okay, and this was a big conference in 1927. What about our conference? Well, we've got 7 Nobel laureates coming. And they'll all be here the 5th and 6th of September. We've got Linda Buck, who won the Nobel Prize for the sense of smell and perception. Bernd Ferengi is a famous chemist for nanomachines. John O'Keefe is a neuroscientist for place cells. Michael Rosbash won the Nobel Prize last year for circadian rhythm. Susumu Tanagawa, who's now become a neuroscientist, one for immunology, antibody diversity. Jim himself is going to be, we're keeping Jim in a cage, mainly, and a gag around him. He's coming to reminisce about when he was 15. Ada Yonath is a fantastic ribosome structural biologist. They're all the 7 Nobel laureates, but more importantly are the other speakers. There's a big mix of people here. Young and old, fantastic range of ages here. All fantastic experts in their fields. Svante Pääbo, the man who got Neanderthal DNA, is there. Nick Lane, I mentioned him already. Carl Dieseroth. They reckon at least 3 of these will win the Nobel Prize in the coming 3, 4, 5 years for their discoveries, we hope. And they're all coming to answer that question, what is life? 75 years later, and speculate on that very question again. And then Dan Dennett's given the keynote. My hope is, and Tina would agree, what we're hoping here is that we will look back on this event and think it's as important as Schrodinger's lecture in 1942. We've given them a big ask. Really speculate. Give us your best shot in whatever way you want on what is life. And they may say something about what started here. Yet again, Ireland would have saved civilization in the face of Donald Trump and Brexit. Now's the time for Ireland to rise up again, I'll tell you. So that's our dream, that we'd repeat the whole thing again. And as I've said, you can watch it on live stream or ask Jana for a ticket. And I might finish with a shameless plug, and Jana gave me permission. My own book is coming out in the middle of the conference. The conference is all about my book. And this called Human Logic. It's a bit similar. Schrodinger's mentioned a lot. It's about the science of being human. So make sure you buy yourself a reduced copy of that book as well. So thanks very much.